Welcome back, everyone, for our next panel discussion, which is about how can we achieve effective multi-stakeholder cooperation on digital governance. Our panel chair will be Chris Mundini, who is Managing Director for Europe at ICANN. We also have Arik Chowdhury, Head of Digital Policy at the Royal Society. We have Leah Kasper, Executive Director at Global Digital Partners. And we also have Ihsan Khan, Board Member for the Internet Society Youth Standing Group.
Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Chris Mondini. As you can see, I'm the Managing Director for ICANN based in Brussels. I have an excellent panel of very experienced and insightful panelists, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves briefly in just a moment. I wanted to set the scene a little bit for the panel. Multi-stakeholderism is the theme of this Internet Governance Forum, the UK Internet Governance Forum. And we know very well that it was organized by a multi-stakeholder committee. And it's very well organized and very well done. And I want to make my compliments to everyone that's associated with it in terms of the venue, the logistics, the technology, and so forth. In the broader world, it's really a transformative time for the subject of multi-stakeholderism when you think of the various UN processes that are underway. You think about the IGF being in the spotlight, and you think about the many different forms and reasons for which we can apply multi-stakeholder governance. I work for ICANN, which is a multi-stakeholder model, managing a rather defined set of resources for the world, and even that can be arduous and complex. And now there are so many digital issues that we want to address at a societal or a global level. It's really a good time to learn more about what are the good practices, what's a good definition, and what can we learn from the various examples. And we'll be asking you to chime in with your questions, examples, observations toward the end of the panel. But without any further delay, I'd like to get to our panelists. So I will please ask Arik to start with a quick introduction of yourself. And the question is maybe a quick summary in your view of what do you believe effective means in the context of our panel title, Effective Multi-Stakeholder Cooperation?
Yes, so my name is Arik Chowdhury. Sorry. Hello. Yes, my name is Arik Chowdhury. I'm head of policy for data and digital technologies at the Royal Society. If you're not aware, the Royal Society is the UK's National Academy of Science. We're also a fellowship of the world's leading scientists, and we have a mission to promote science for the benefit of humanity. So my focus there is to think about how we can promote the use of data and digital technologies to alleviate societal challenges. Prior to this, I spent several years working in the broad space of tech policy. I ran my own small think tank for 6.5 years called Web Roots Democracy. I also worked in government. I used to also be, very briefly, worked in audit. So I used to take ICAEW exams with the building we're in. So it's very, very interesting. Anyway, on the question of what effective means in this context, so we think about this at the Royal Society from the perspective of understanding the views of our diverse scientific community, of which there are vastly different opinions, lots of different incentives at play. And effective, I would say, involves understanding what the consensus is amongst the community, and then also understanding where the divisions of opinion are. Because I think a lot of what multi-stakeholder governance is about having a discussion forum. It's about understanding, where the community might be at, even if you don't come to a decision. It's about highlighting some of those differences and areas of agreement.
That's great. All right, so we'll turn to Leah. And tell us about yourself, please, and define effective for us.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here today at the UK IGF. I'm the Executive Director of Global Partners Digital. We're a human rights UK-based organization that's been in this kind of internet policy space for nearly 2 decades now. you have more information about me in the on the website, I think. But I want to kind of turn to Chris's question immediately, and to start with, I wanted to do a little exercise and ask us to replace the word in this sentence, multi-stakeholderism, multi-stakeholder cooperation, with something else. So what if we replace that with, say, democracy? Okay, and we ask a question of what is effective democracy? It is a hard question to answer, and the reason why this is a complicated question to answer is because democracy is not just one thing, and advancing it or making it effective is not just one thing, right? It includes having an independent media, having free and fair elections, having an educated populace. So if we go back now then to thinking about multi-stakeholderism in a similar way, because in a sense they're both governance concepts, but in this case we are talking about a governance concept that is specific and captures properties that are characteristic for the use, development, and governance of digital technologies, okay? So if you think about what that really is and the different scenarios that kind of are captured by the use, development, and governance of digital tech, you can think of, from management of or laying of undersea cables, so infrastructure. You can think about developing a protocol, or you can think about the management of content on a social media website. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that depending on where you are and what actual problem you're trying to solve, you will need to be very thoughtful about the ways in which what Chris was talking about, which is the open, inclusive, transparent, consensus-based principles or characteristics of multi-stakeholderism, how you apply them to that specific context. And if I may just end on this kind of introductory point by saying that we have been talking about this for at least since I've entered the field, so since WSIS definitely, but I remember in 2012 when I first started thinking about internet governance, and it almost feels like we haven't moved on this question. So I think the question that we can try to answer here, and together with you all, is how we get from that level of principles, the 40,000 feet definitions and principles that we have, to something that is more practical and yet isn't prescriptive in a sense that you define a model for each of those scenarios that I just mentioned, because that's not feasible either. And I'll offer kind of my answer to that question, but I'll end there for this round.
Oh, we have a cliffhanger. That's great. Thanks. So, Arik, you've talked about defining things like consensus and the utility even of identifying divisions. And Leah, thank you for your comments, because I think this question about what is the issue we are trying to govern together lends itself to thinking thoughtfully about the different techniques and processes. I'm going to turn to Ihsan. Please tell us about you and your view of what's effectiveness.
Sure, thanks. My name's Ihsan Khan. I'm the board member of the Internet Society's Youth Standing Group, which is one of the numerous special interest groups for different sort of areas. We have one for online safety, for example, as well. We have one on gender. So there's one that's focused specifically on youth interests, and this topic in particular is quite important for the youth community, because the only reason the youth community is effectively able to sort of take part in these discussions is because of this sort of multi-stakeholder model that we have. This is not what I do by day. By day, I do data protection and cybersecurity, and like moonlight, I guess, as perhaps a diplomat on behalf of the youth. But the youth is not really a monolithic group. We are, quite sort of diverse as well, and there are many sort of stakeholders within that sort of youth community as well. We were having conversations earlier about, for example, because of the definition of the youth community being so broad, basically anyone under the age of 30, you have teens who have completely separate interests to people who are perhaps on the upper end of that scale. I know that a lot of people here effectively consider themselves to be part of the youth community, despite the fact that you've been here for way longer than I've been alive. But it's all about what's in the mind. But I think the way that I'd like to answer this question is perhaps by answering it in the negative, in the sense of what I think multi-stakeholder cooperation should not look like. Primarily because This is part of the lived experience that I have along with a lot of other members of the youth community, for example, taking part in the Global Digital Compact processes, which, a term was introduced to me by you, Chris, which is multi-stakeholder washing, effectively, because, there were a lot of worries of the governance of the internet and other digital technologies moving towards a slightly more multilateral rather than multi-stakeholder setup, where it prioritized the interests of governmental sort of stakeholders over and above others. And I think the Global Digital Compact process was a sort of example of that, where multilateral processes tended to perhaps potentially co-opt, although that's not necessarily the right word, multi-stakeholder involvement. We were able to take part and participate in these sort of processes through, for example, consultation responses, very long, lengthy documents. We were able to, have like a 3-minute sort of speaking slot where we said what we had to say, and then we sort of moved on through, a very long list of individuals who also had something completely different to say. But there was no real dialogue. There was no sort of. It was very transactional, and I think that is one of the issues that we've seen, where you try to orchestrate these sorts of mechanisms to get multi-stakeholder participation without actually, and I think this is the crucial thing. Like, there are many different characteristics of what makes perhaps an effective multi-stakeholder process. But I think one of them is this direct translation between the input and the output of the stakeholders, which is something that is, for me at least, a sine qua non. Like, you need to have that, without which I think no matter how good you're able to create a sort of system, it might not actually translate to being effective. It's just participatory. And I think I'd like to engage with the other stakeholders a little bit more on that in due course. But thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. I have to say it is one of the amazing skills that many of my colleagues and community members have of being able to assimilate inputs and produce outputs in a way that demonstrate that all of the inputs have been taken into account, even though they don't necessarily always arrive at what the consensus conclusion is. And so I really like that and I like that you've given us a real-world example, even though it's a negative example. It sounds like your view is that it was more performative or transactional than genuine in the context of the Global Digital Compact. Does anyone have other examples, or would anyone like to give an example of something that's worked well? Leah.
Thanks, Chris. So thank you for bringing up the GDC. The Global Digital Compact is an interesting, I think, use case that we can test. I do want to note, maybe before we kind of go into testing whether something is effective or not, I think there's a missing step between the kind of principle and the application and the measurements, if you want to be really kind of technical about it. Over the years, the work that we've been doing, especially around like 2015, 2016, I remember at GPD, we dug really deep into what a multi-stakeholder approach to cybersecurity national strategies would look like. So if you're developing a national cybersecurity strategy, what would it mean to make that process multi-stakeholder? And kind of to help us there, we took those characteristics, I think, like that, most of the different frameworks that you mentioned, that Chris mentioned as well, so open, inclusive, transparent, consensus-based. And we tried to say, okay, what would that look like in the context of cybersecurity? And we then realized that, and there are some examples where we've tested that, but what we found that is, before you can even start answering that question and defining to what extent something should be open, inclusive, transparent, and consensus-based, there are a couple of pre-questions that you have to ask. And one of them is, who are the relevant stakeholders? Well, actually, we can start with, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Then the next question is then, well, who are the stakeholders that need to be involved in solving that problem? And maybe it's, what type of expertise do you need to have in the room to achieve that outcome that we were talking about, so input, output. And then you also have to think about the constraints. Yes, so cybersecurity is an interesting example because it does have a lot of constraints, given that it's tightly linked to national security issues, yeah? So it might be a different set of constraints that you might have in a cybersecurity context that you would not have in another context. But maybe, can I ask a question, and then maybe we can think through an example together? So let's take the GDC and turn Izan's kind of postulated that wasn't an inclusive or multi-stakeholder process. And let's say, what would it look like if it were multi-stakeholder, okay? So if we take that framework that I just played around with, say, like you want to kind of make sure that you assess, let's say you're sitting in the Secretary General's office, yeah, and you're setting out this process from the get-go. And you look at what you think like the ingredients are of multi-stakeholderism, open, inclusive, transparent, consensus-based. But then you sit down with your team and you start thinking about, okay, how broad is the scope of this thing that I'm doing? So maybe, anyway, someone can, is it broad, narrow, how broad? It's broad, right?
Really broad.
It's really broad. National, regional, global, it's global, okay? That's another thing to think about. The type of expertise that is required is, again, broad, yeah? So, and the impact on stakeholders is going to be felt around the world. So these are all kind of considerations that when you start thinking about who the relevant stakeholders are. But then you take it next. So what are some of the constraints that you might have? Anyone? Like any constraints that you have as a team setting up this process? Shout it out. Just anything.
Money.
Money. Yes. What else?
Inclusion,
Inclusion. Connectivity. What else? Time. Exactly. Time. You have a timeline. Yeah. So you have 2 years. Let's say they started thinking about it a couple of years ago. You know, you have a 2-year framework. You want to include as broad a range of stakeholders because you define that the scope is very broad and you need broad range of expertise, input, output. So you sit down and you're like, all right, okay. Oh, and one more constraint that's really important in this case. It is going to end with an intergovernmentally negotiated document. Yes? So you put all of that in a cauldron and you say like, all right, now let's come up with a kind of roadmap for it. So all of this to say is that it's not a simple kind of like, you know, like a magic wand. I think it's helpful to have a framework, and maybe we can, like, if people are interested, we can take that to the next level and actually design the process when we get to practical things that you can do to make it more inclusive, more open, more inclusive. But I just want to point out that kind of those broad considerations need to be something that are put front and center of considering what a multi-stakeholder, effective multi-stakeholder cooperation might look like.
Oh, I wish you were sitting in the Secretary General's office a few months ago. It's really a wonderful vision of a thoughtful, albeit arduous approach. But I think it's inspiring, and I think it's something that we can talk about why there's not more of that. I'm curious, Arik, from your experience at Royal Society, is there good examples that you can talk about, and what made them good for you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good examples out there. I think, like Leo was saying, it really depends on how broad or narrow the area of focus is. So one area that we look at a lot at the Royal Society is open science. So we recently completed a project called Science in the Age of AI, which is looking at how AI is changing the nature and methods of scientific research. And one aspect of that piece of work was looking at how scientists can get involved in sort of governance questions and questions around data ethics and questions around AI safety when producing their own tools that they use in research or tools that get deployed elsewhere in society. And the sort of open science principles offer a framework in which to do that. They offer, guidance over like what should be made open in terms of data or protocols or code or research, or we spoke about in our report around there needing to be work around publishing failed results more. So we're having lots of LLMs trained on like successful academic research, but not enough perhaps on some of the failed areas. But those are very narrow processes where lots of people can comment or make tweaks or highlight challenges, or people can come to consensus if they're working on individual projects. I think beyond that, we tried to do a lot of work on influencing, government and other international policy. But taking the UK government as one example of focus, it can be very difficult to influence the UK government or try to build sort of multi-stakeholder approaches to influencing specific bills. Many people in this room would have been involved in the online safety bill, which again was in some ways a good example of multi-stakeholder cooperation, where you had a lot of people involved, but even then it was still quite difficult, and not everyone is going to win from those processes. I think another challenge is also just understanding how to get involved and standardizing some of these processes. So there are lots of people at organizations who are coming up with their own ways of solving governance challenges. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is focusing on AI safety again. We've looked at red teaming as a way to sort of highlighting and mitigating some of the harms around disinformation on large language models, particularly around scientific disinformation. We did an initiative ahead of the AI Safety Summit last year where we got climate and infectious disease experts to try and break the guardrails of Meta's Llama 2 and sort of highlight the benefits of getting scientists involved in that process because they understand the specifics of it. And there are lots of organizations trying to do this and companies are trying to do this themselves, but there is no standardized approach for how to do good red teaming. Another example is you can also take a technical approach to achieving this. So one other area we look at is data governance broadly, because there's lots of useful data held out there, one in the public sector, but also in private companies, and there's lots of reasons to not share that data with others. But there are tools and techniques which could allow people to gain insights from data without accessing it. So we've done a lot of work on privacy enhancing technologies. And again, there's much more work to be done on standardizing these processes, understanding what works, what doesn't work, thinking about ethical approaches. So I think there are good narrow examples out there depending on the goal you're trying to achieve and the type of governance you're trying to achieve. And I think that the Global Digital Compact, which we also try to get involved in, was, like you said, naturally probably the hardest example of this that exists out there because, like you said, it's global and it's primarily still agreed by governments, even though it is theoretically involving anyone who wants to contribute to it.
That's great. So we've talked a lot about sort of frameworks and conceiving how to start with who's the proper, the questions that Leah posed. And I really like that you gave us a number of examples, Eric, where that were quite different actually, and which would have needed a sort of a more rigorous questioning at the beginning, as I think Leah is advocating, before thinking of what would be most effective. I want to talk about tools, techniques, processes, but did you want to, Ihsan, talk about a good example, an effective example?
Sure. I think one of the natural consequences of working on something so broad is the fact that there isn't exactly a solution that works for every single situation, especially when it comes to digital governance based on what you're trying to achieve. I think a good example, funnily enough, also exists within the context of the GDC, which is what the Internet Society's Youth Standing Group did, and in partnership with the Youth Coalition on Internet Governance, which is one of the dynamic coalitions of the IGF. And it mirrored, I think, in principle at least, or in spirit, what actually happened during Net Mondial and Net Mondial Plus 10, which is that it was like very, very chaotic, but in a very good way. It was all about trying to achieve consensus, very rough consensus on certain key areas that the Global Digital Compact was sort of focusing on, and really to sort of get down to the core of what the youth actually believed in and sort of getting rid of everything else that was sort of bells and whistles on the side, or maybe perhaps an irrelevant tangent, or perhaps something that was like a very, very niche interest that one of the members might have brought out, but that other people may not necessarily agree, fit in the scope of what was trying to be discussed. And I think those are good examples because we are able to solicit opinions from a lot of different people from different stakeholder groups. We're able to get their voices heard, and we're able to also make sure it's like basically a very large document with 100 people editing it, and everyone can see everyone's edits, and then people can sort of look at that and go like, I agree with this, I want to vote for this, I want to include this in the context of this document, and so on. And so I think, it was one example of, I think, a method that might not work in every single situation. I mean, if you're trying to come up with a sort of position paper in terms of what everyone agrees should happen versus you're, working on something that's like policy or something like legislation, which is very technical, the multi-stakeholder requirements will be different for each of them, right? And so I kind of agree with what Leah said, which is that, we have to be a little bit nuanced talking about the GDC process and the constraints that the UN Secretary General, or at least the Envoy on Technology, had. I kind of disagree with the fact that it had to be intergovernmentally negotiated as a document, because if we see what happened with Net Mundial Plus 10 and the Sao Paulo multi-stakeholder guidelines, we can see that, you know, it is possible to develop a consensus document without it needing intergovernmental negotiation per se. I think the thing that the Net Mundial Plus 10 situation lacked was the participation of governmental stakeholders, which is where the UN Tech Envoy could have been involved. The whole job of the UN as an organization is to sort of act as this coordinating mechanism for governmental stakeholders. So if there's already a parallel process happening where you are able to come with this position paper, they're supposed to team up, and then you would be able to have a little bit more legitimacy to that process. Because again, one of the biggest criticisms of any single multi-stakeholder process that exists is the fact that there's one stakeholder group that's being overrepresented, right? For example, in the IGF, it's like, oh, we have too much civil society participation, but not enough governmental participation. Or, you know, for example, in IETF, we have too much private sector participation. So I think that, you know, it kind of, the whole point is to try to bring these stakeholders together, and that's, you know, where, you know, if we look at the WSIS definition, their respective roles and responsibilities, this is where the UN should have been involved, I think.
That's great. I'm delighted that you raised those examples. Leah, please chime in.
To finger on that, let's take another example then, and say we're dealing with an incident response. You know, so you're sitting in a national computer emergency response team, and I totally agree what you're saying, and I think in the not totally agree, qualify that. I think when it comes to the GDC, there could have been like different ways of approaching that process, but I do want to say that it can be misleading to give this idea that, you know, like all stakeholders should be consulted at all levels and to come up with every solution when it comes to digital governance. I'm not saying that you're saying that, but if you take a very narrow example of having 48 hours to deal with an incident where a cyber attack is taking place targeting national infrastructure, at that point, you can argue, so this falls under digital technology governance framework, according to Tunis, if you read it, so it applies, right? So it's an internet-related public policy issue that someone is dealing with. But who is involved in that process, right? It's not entirely open. It's not maximum consensus-based. At that point, you have 48 hours to deal with an incident. So again, I just want to say that really depends on kind of what problem you're solving for. I do want to give an example of I see Paul's just walked in the room. Very happy to see him here because I was going to give an example of what I think is effective multi-stakeholderism in practice that the UK government has been leading on and been championing for like over a decade now. And that is this, what we used to call it MAGIG, and it's now been renamed into a multi-stakeholder internet governance group that a number of us here have been a part of for a number of years. And it is a government-facilitated group that seeks to inform UK government policy and positions on a variety and engagements in a variety of internet governance settings. And it includes the IGF, which arguably anyone can attend, but it ranges all the way up to engaging in the ITU, which is an intergovernmental body. And I'm sitting here with where I can tell you that there is text right now in an ITU resolution that I have drafted because I was on that group and as a result participated in the UK delegation to an ITU plenipotentiary conference. So it is possible. There are constraints, though, when you sit as part of a government delegation in an intergovernmental process. But I would say that that's a really, really, really good and I want to say a noteworthy, laudable example of multi-stakeholderism at the national level.
Thank you for that. I was a little alarmed by the emergency time constraint. I think it's raising the degree of difficulty in your emergency example. But the MAGIG, which now has a new name, which I was told. What's the new name?
MIG, UK.
Oh, well, there you go. I think it has a lot to do with the experience of the governmental bodies involved in terms of seeing the results and seeing the benefits. And I think there's a long history of getting better answers and better results by consulting stakeholders and doing it, genuinely in a consensus-based way. I like also, Isan, that you used the word chaos in your response. I think there is something about these early stages of consulting with stakeholders. There's a certain facilitated chaos that helps to surface, as you said, ideas. And I, as somebody who was also involved in the original Net Mundial, I think others here were as well. It was well balanced among the stakeholder groups, and it was a little confusing and chaotic at times, and I was delighted to see that the Net Mundial plus 10 actually advanced and some of the questions and the principles we're discussing. Sort of practically speaking, in terms of like specific tools, technologies, methods in the actual stakeholder processes themselves, is there anything that you are using more? Has technology, innovation helped? Can we feed, the entire history of every transcript of ICANN into a AI model to just put it on autopilot? But any practical tips or tools that you've seen? Arik, how about at Royal Society?
Yeah, we're still quite analog, if I'm honest with you, at the Royal Society, and this is a limitation of our work. So, again, our work at the Royal Society is quite narrow, but it's the science community is still very broad, and often we get, well, not often, occasionally we get people asking, how do I get invited to something, or how can we share our perspectives in some discussion? We had this ahead of the AI Safety Summit. We did a joint workshop with the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology around horizon scanning, AI safety risks across scientific disciplines. And we decided to make this in-person only, because sometimes to get the kinds of people you might want in the room, you have to make it in person. Otherwise, people just won't show up, because some people will want to meet other people. They don't just want to go simply to share their perspective on an issue. They want to go for the networking and the relationship building, etc. Obviously, like Leah was saying, you're limited therefore by your resource, and in our case, it's a room. So it is difficult to think about how to do this properly. I want to share a very different example, actually, if I can. So I used to work for a Labour member of Parliament called Graham Allen, and he's very interested in something called a citizens' convention or a constitutional convention, which is this idea that you could gather ordinary citizens over a prolonged period of time to come to a consensus on a controversial constitutional issue or a topic or any topic, actually. And when I worked for him, part of my role was to think about how we could do this digitally. And his vision was something like 10 million founding fathers and mothers of a new UK constitution, something like this. And in that research, it became very clear that these things don't work unless there is real buy-in from the outset from the decision makers who are going to implement whatever it is that you're looking at. So where they do have constitutional conventions and where they work successfully, say in Ireland, they have buy-in from the government who will say, we will, put money into this, which is important, because if you want people to really participate, sometimes you have to get them to come out of work. So, and if you want to be inclusive of like low-income individuals, etc., you're going to need to pay them to participate. Another example is, they had like very nice invitation cards sent out, so that it's taken seriously, that people don't throw it in the bin. Or in the US, where they have a mechanism for this. I can't remember exactly how it works, but you need a certain number of states have to vote in favour of having a constitutional convention, then you can change the constitution. So if we were to try something here in the UK without that buy-in, it just won't work, because people won't show up. There won't be the money behind it. There won't be a guarantee that if you participate in this process, something will change as a result. So I think tools are useful, and V-Taiwan is a good example that's often cited. But you need to have buy-in and people try to think about how we can replicate that here. But you need to have buy-in from decision makers for that to work. So I'd say there are lots of limitations there.
That's great. Those are great. That's very helpful. Anyone else want to comment on tools, approaches, processes, technologies that you've used or you've seen, you've adopted?
I'll start. Again, I don't think that's necessarily the most important thing. I've think we're kind of not there yet where we agreed on a framework, and before we do that, kind of the tools are secondary. But there have been things that from general participatory democracy that we can also kind of learn from other processes that are useful in our way of thinking of creating more consensus-based outcomes, if that is what we agree is part of multi-stakeholderism. And Net Mundial, the original one, actually, I was there in 2014, and that was a really interesting example of consensus-based outcome document where you had different stakeholders at the same level. There's a whole question of to what extent that is applicable to legacy processes that we already have in international relations. I think let's not be naive about where this applies and how. There are tensions between what we have right now in international relations and cooperation and what we're talking about here. So I kind of, if you don't mind me following up on that, just to say that, and it goes back to also my experience at MAGIG, now MIG UK, where originally, when I started looking at internet governance, I have this kind of problem-oriented academic mind where, like, I need a framework, I'm going to measure, we're going to come up with everything, and then you present that, and it still doesn't happen. And I remember kind of making the point, this was sometime in 2013 maybe, it's like, oh, this is so great that the UK government is doing this for the ITU. Yes, let's now, next step, like GPD at the UN General Assembly on the UK delegation discussing cybersecurity. Did that happen? No, it didn't. And I couldn't understand it at the time. For me, it was all part of the Tunis agenda definition of internet governance, cybersecurity, or discussing something at the ITU. In my mind, it was all like, yeah, why not? The issue I think that I've learned is that the problem that we're talking about here is not academic or practical, but it is political. And the issue that we're dealing with kind of goes into the fact that the multi-stakeholder cooperative model that we're talking about, I don't know if you want to call it model or approach, doesn't really matter, but the idea has evolved from the necessity of techies, really kind of solutions-oriented technologists, who just had to deal and manage the root, right, and DNS, and like that's where it came from. And they were dealing with technical problems that can be, I'm simplifying here, can be measured in ones and zeros. But when you translate that to, and this is what we're talking about here, now the digital tech has become mainstream across the whole of society. What we're talking about is applying the same model, which is quite technocratic, to socio-economic political issues, right? With security, with child online protection. That's not the same as resolving a technical problem. I mean, Chris said, you can, although obviously, and there's been arguments about like how these are now merged and technical and policy are basically one. I don't think it's the same. I think there is a difference between a technical issue and kind of a more policy, broader issues that we're dealing with when you kind of step outside that narrow technical definition of IG.
I think that's probably a good really transition to talking about the future and hopefulness. On the one hand, it's very inspiring that you see more attempts by more bodies and organizations to adopt, however ill-informed they may be, multi-stakeholder processes to address problems. But on the other hand, and particularly in the global digital governance sphere, here we are as proponents of multi-stakeholder governance in a context of a geopolitical era, which is really much more competitive, confrontational, and almost centrifugal. And so in addition, for example, to ICANN's having a defined technical resource for governance, it also grew up in a time and was established in a much more globalized context for the world. So I suppose my question for you is about the future. Are you hopeful that multi-stakeholder cooperation and governance will continue to have successes? And or what's the big picture for the future of multi-stakeholder governance, and what advice would you have for its proponents?
I'm quite optimistic, so I think naturally we've all kind of touched upon some of the limitations of this, but no one really disagrees that this is a good thing to have. And I think what we've seen is it'd be shocking to see major pieces of governance or legislation or whatever it is done without first thinking about multi-stakeholder governance. And I think as sort of the internet space and AI, whatever it might be, kind of continues to mature, you're seeing a lot of people who are now experienced in doing this for decades, who will get good at doing it and better at doing it, and be able to take those lessons forward into doing it much better and more effective in future. And whether that's with new tools or with a proper understanding of how to get people involved, how to keep people included, I think that will only really get better. I think the key thing is making sure it doesn't really slow down, and making sure that it's not being done for the sake of it. Things I've been involved in. I can't think of specific examples now, but the ones where I feel frustrated is where it's a tick box exercise, and I'm sure many of us will have felt this, where you're asked to show up and share your opinion just so that someone else can say that they did multi-stakeholder governance, but really didn't pay attention to what was being said. So I'm quite optimistic. I think this is the norm now, but I think it's a question of how to perfect it.
That's great. I'm going to ask Ihsan, you're involved with youth. That's the future. What do you think's happening in the future?
I mean, we kind of have to be optimistic, not gonna lie. I mean, if we weren't, we wouldn't be doing stuff like this. And, the more authoritarian elements and angles would be able to dominate the discussion, right? And we present a very important force in resisting that and making sure that multi-stakeholderism continues to be the MO of at least internet governance, if not, other areas of international global cooperation. I want to touch upon, sort of weave this discussion into the previous one based on what Leah was saying of how this is like a very, very political sort of problem, and the political situation, political buy-in is equally as important, and we have to consider sort of like legacy institutions and how we can sort of, work this in that context. I mean, I would tend to disagree a little bit over there because, well, two reasons. Number one, international law only exists in textbooks on international law. It's like a very famous aphorism because, again, like the whole Global Digital Compact process and the institutions or the high-level panels or advisory boards and all the other devices, let's call it that, that the Secretary General put in place leading up to the GDC were all sort of like arbitrarily designed almost, like especially in terms of the composition of those high-level panels, including the high-level panel on AI, which was like out a couple years ago as well. Like we have the ability to design what future we want. Right, and I think that's something that gets lost a lot in like these very deeply technical discussions about, legislation and rules and procedure, and I think like the youthful part of me. Well, I mean, I am part of the youth, but like the youthful part of all of us, I feel, should like try to like have that naivety and that optimism, that blind desire to try to push for a better future and to rally around the organizations that we have the capability of influencing, right? So over here, we have, for example, an in towards governmental sort of organizations and individuals, for example, in the crowd, regulatory organizations, members of the private sector. We should expand our influence over here and try to say, this is the kind of future that we want. This is what we actually want to try out. And so in terms of designing, for example, different multi-stakeholder processes, we should experiment. We should, for example, create like almost a like regulatory sort of sandbox of sorts to try out different ways of getting people's input towards things that they would ultimately be affected by. And that's the reason why we have multi-stakeholder governance, right? It's like we have agency, we have the consent of the governed, effectively. It's an extension, as like Leah said, drawing back to the discussion that was had in the very beginning, like just replace multi-stakeholder cooperation with democracy. That's basically what we're trying to do over here. So I am optimistic, and I do believe that there are better paths that we can all craft together, and that's the positive note that I want to leave everyone on. It's like we can imagine a better future. It's very schoolboyish, but I feel like the more people that have that attitude, the better, and we can easily get drawn down in all of these technical discussions that make us lose sight of that. So
So we have 2 votes for optimism, and we're about to go to questions. Leah, just on a final note, optimistic about the future?
Pessimistic in the short term, optimistic in the long term. Like the GDC is one example, and I do want to say that now going into the WSIS plus 20 review, I know we have a panel coming up this afternoon talking about that. Haven't been there for the original WSIS, but having been there for the WSIS plus 10, already kind of looking at how the process, we have David Suter here in the audience. I know he's going to be hopefully telling us more about what that process is going to look like. But just comparing it to what we had even for the plus 10, from my perspective, we've seen a backtracking on some of the commitments to open up and implement some of these, I want to say, innovative approaches to governance, especially when it comes to the UN. So we were quite disheartened by the kind of the what the GDC looked like, and even the institutions that have kind of made inroads and improvements. UNESCO is one of them, for instance. They've done a great job in recommendations on the ethics of AI and other frameworks. But then when they come up with a different process, it's almost like they forget that they've already done kind of this multi-stakeholder cooperation. So I don't know. I think there's we need to be, I think, cognizant of like, yes, while we can kind of be hopeful and keep the principles in mind, there is a battle ahead, and I think I want us to be pragmatic about that.
Great, thanks for that very nuanced approach to the question. All right, so now it's your turn if you have questions or comments, and I'm sure we'll have some online. We have just a few minutes left. So I'm going to start over here at the far end, please.
Hello, Aranio Mary Isfa. There's a quote: "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." And that was a quote by Shirley Chisholm. She was the first Black woman to run for the US presidency in 1972. And she's the giant on whose shoulders Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris stand. My question is for Leah regarding the scenario you outlined about the frameworks, because in 2017, the Africa Internet Summit was held in Kenya. And at that time, Cameroon was experiencing an internet shutdown. And during one of the discussions, which got really heated, it was about, you know, what can be done. Now, fast forward to 2024, Kenya itself experienced an internet shutdown. The Kenyan IGF had to be pushed back because of that. And I remember at the time trying to bring the concept of internet shutdowns into one of these multilateral meetings, and I was effectively shut down. So when you decide on a framework, does it take into account the geopolitics of what's happening in the world? I consider myself to be a global citizen. I was born here. I've got a British passport, but my parents are from the border of Kenya and Uganda. So at that time, I don't think internet shutdowns were as high on the agenda as they are today, given everything that's going on. So I got the impression when I voiced what was happening, it was, okay, this framework is fixed. So my question to you is, shouldn't it be a bit more malleable? Or is it that because I was considered to be from the global majority, my input wasn't welcome? Suffice to say, I'm not only going to bring a folding chair, but I'm building my own table.
That's great. Leah, do you have a response? It seems to me you talked about starting out with the framework, and as I interpret the question, is the framework evolvable or malleable to make room for when we realize that not every participant is appropriately included?
I mean, absolutely. Of course it is. Actually, Kenya is a really interesting example. They actually have, they're one of the few countries that I am aware of, maybe the only, that has actually a provision for multi-stakeholder, for the multi-stakeholder approach in their constitution. So there's actually like a constitutional right to contribute to shaping policy in Kenya. So obviously then, like when it comes to, there's always question of the gap between the principle and its implementation. And we often, like coming from a human rights organization, it's not that we don't have the rules, it's just that we have an international framework for human rights. We were talking about this before the panel started. It's just that sometimes it's not implemented. So I would say it is our joint responsibility to make to make the operationalization of existing principles better, and at the same time kind of work to improve the frameworks themselves.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more in the room and then go to online. Please, you, sir.
I joined ISOC nearly 30 years ago. I paid $25, and the expectation was that I was going to try to help bring in a user voice. Now, the user multi-stakeholders are conspicuous by their absence. We'll take consumers, Mumsnet, Parentkind, Youth Voice in the UK, their equivalents in most other countries. We'll take business from FSB up to HSBC. About a decade ago, a consortium of banks tried to join ICANN and IETF with big budgets to try to introduce due diligence into the domain name system. It took about 18 months, but they were seen off very firmly. This is not the business of the users. Go away. Governance is we lovely supplier-side community and our acolytes. Does governance include a user voice? If so, who's actually going to encourage and welcome users to get involved, bearing in mind that if they're totally ignored, they go off and they do things through the ITU with governments around the world that totally sod up your nice, cosy model, or risk doing so?
Thank you. I have an answer, but I'm just curious. Well, I would please. I encourage you to come back to ICANN. We're kicking off on Monday, November 11th. I know it's a holiday. People will be free. You can sit down with your cup of coffee and follow an ICANN public meeting. It's in Istanbul, so it'll be a nice early morning start for you. They're simultaneously interpreted, they're broadcast completely hybrid, participatory, ask your question, get involved. And you will see that we, at least at ICANN, have a very active and global at-large community, which is dedicated to the user's interest. And in fact, they are an advisory committee that really looks at every ICANN policy that's coming out and puts it through the filter of how will this affect the user. They add a lot of value to the process. And so I'd love to chat with you about how that's evolved. I'm just curious, please, Arik, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, so most of my examples are quite narrow, but this is a really important question. One project we've been doing at the moment at the Society is it's called Disability Data and Assistive Technologies. So we're looking at the landscape of assistive tech for people with disabilities, thinking about how we can advance them and look at market failures, think about low-shot machine learning, etc. And something which has come up a lot in this conversation is how do we get users involved? Who are those users? Where do you get them involved at what stage? And in the disability space, that there are no real representative voices of people with disabilities, because each even category of disability is very different and people have different needs. So I think to answer this question on a much broader scale, so we're looking at a very relatively narrow case, but looking at a much broader case would be so difficult, and I'd be very interested to know, either from yourself or others, how the user voice could ever be really properly integrated into these sorts of global multi-stakeholder governance models.
Thank you for that. Let's go, please, to an online question.
Yeah, so we have a question from Siva Subramaniam M, and they say, if in the IGF, civil society, and in the IETF, the private sector, participate in higher numbers, is it possible that governments tend to gain more even with visibly fewer numbers? So I think the first bit is a statement of IGF, lots of civil society, IETF, lots of private sector, governments, not so many people, but do they tend to gain more even though there are less of them?
Yeah, I think this is a question about unfair advantage or dominance, which, as long as we've been in this field, I'm sure we can all talk about perceptions of that, and do governments have an unfair example? I think we touched upon that a little bit in the panel discussion, but I'm just looking. Isan, please.
Sure. I think so. One of the reasons why governments don't necessarily, this is again, pure hypothesis. This is just the perception of myself as well as others that I've spoken to in the context of the IGF. Is number one, I mean, there's three reasons, right? Number one's capacity building, especially for smaller states or states that don't necessarily have as much of an interest or say in digital infrastructure related questions, maybe because they're already far ahead in their own journey, or perhaps they don't really know. So capacity building is another potential problem in the public sector sort of space, especially if digital is not as high on their list. So that's one reason why we don't see governmental participation over there. But the second, and I think the most important reason, is basically the IGF acts as a forum for global policy discussion and the exchange of these ideas. And it's not the only forum that does that. There are plenty of other organizations that do that, that do involve governmental stakeholders and no one else. And I think it's all about the willingness of these governments to learn from other sort of stakeholders rather than purely from other governments. And again, this leads to a slightly more politically charged question of what do governments actually want to do with the internet? And the main thing that they really want to do, from what we've seen at least, in terms of this digital divide, not necessarily in terms of access to communication, but I'm talking about the digital political divide, is whether they want to adopt a slightly more free or open route towards the governance of the internet, or whether they want to have a more authoritarian version of the internet, in which case the IGF isn't actually going to help their purposes over there, because what they don't want is multi-stakeholderism, right? And so I think that ultimately governments do have the home field advantage in their own home nation, right? They are the ones that set the rules. And so if they don't intend to actually take part in global policy discussions, we won't see them. They already have the unfair home advantage. And so I think that's part of the reason why we don't really see as many governmental sort of stakeholders in these fora, and we should actually be encouraging them to not only attend these sort of conferences, but to attend them with a view to understand what other stakeholders are doing. So I'll stop over there because I see that.
That's great. That's really great observation. I would like to, I think we might have time for one more. Do we have any more online?
One more.
I'm going to take another one online, please.
So we have Subhash from United Network who's asked, with the increasing sophistication of AI-powered cyber attacks, how can we ensure that our cybersecurity strategies and governance frameworks keep pace and globally coordinate for this?
Question. Yes. I'm going to. Can I take this next question too, and then I'll let anybody answer either.
Thank you. My concern is about fragmentation. The lovely IETF have published all the standards as they should be standards, which means that a country or regime who wants to succeed from the internet can do so, as, say, North Korea already has done. What can we do about rooting around that? John Gilmore said in 1993, the net interprets damage, interprets censorship as damage and roots around it. Can the rest of the world help root around internet fragmentation?
Okay, well, these are two big topics, and I'm curious if anybody has any pithy response. One's about global coordination in response to cyber attacks, and the other is about what's the best approach? How can we avoid or heal around or fragmentation? Go ahead, please.
So I don't have a good answer to this question. These are very big questions, but I want to highlight or echo the sentiment. So we've done some work a couple of years ago about disinformation, and primarily focused on scientific disinformation and think about the Online Safety Bill Net Act. And one thing that came up in there was this question of censorship. Whether should we censor scientific misinformation was a big question, and we cautioned against that. One reason for it was exactly this problem of fragmentation, but rather than countries, fragmentation amongst across the internet. So you think about the Online Safety Bill, the Online Safety Act, so focused primarily on these big companies, and not really considering that information moves around the internet as it's censored or removed, etc. And now you have lots of different platforms who don't have a public affairs team in London or a contact or a name director, etc. So I think fragmentation is something that should always be considered in these conversations. Like, it's not just the same 5 or 6 big tech companies who control the internet. There are lots of small players. So very much agree that fragmentation is something we should think about, not just on a global scale, but also amongst companies and providers as well.
Well, thank you very much. We've really reached the end of our panel. I expected more WSIS plus 20 questions. I'm sure that will be coming up in the later session. If people are interested, on December 4th, our interim CEO, Sally Costerton, here in London will be convening stakeholders to discuss and consult with UK stakeholders about the WSIS plus 20 process. I'm really delighted for our panel. We discussed frameworks, we discussed principles, we discussed practical approaches, and on balance, we are slightly more optimistic than pessimistic. I invite you to give a round of applause to my colleagues here on the panel.